There are stories in the Bible that at first glance seem like simple accounts of historical events. But when you begin to dig a little deeper, when you go beyond the text and begin to ask who these people were, where they came from, what they felt and what they lived through, you discover that behind every name exists an entire universe of faith, suffering, overcoming, and divine purpose. The story of Joseph, the son of Jacob, is one of those narratives that the more you study, the more layers you find. And one of those layers, perhaps the most underestimated of his entire trajectory, has the name of Asenath. You have probably already heard of Joseph. Everyone knows, at least in general terms, the story of the young man who was sold as a slave by his own brothers, who ended up in Egypt, who was imprisoned unjustly, and who ended his journey as the second most powerful man in the entire country. It is a story of impressive twists and turns, of trials that tested every fiber of his character, and of an unwavering faith that did not succumb even in the darkest hours. But what often goes unnoticed in this narrative is that Joseph did not walk this path alone. Upon reaching the top of Egyptian power, he married a woman who carried a mysterious name, a fascinating origin, and a role much deeper than the verses that mention her seem to suggest at first reading. This woman is Asenath. Today, we are going to dive into this story with all the depth it deserves. We are going to understand who Joseph was, what he lived through before meeting Asenath, what world she came from, what her presence meant within the great plan of God, and what the wise men and scholars throughout the centuries have said about this woman that the Bible mentions so briefly, but whose consequences for the history of Israel were absolutely monumental. To understand Asenath, we first need to understand the man she was called to accompany. Joseph was the 11th of the 12 sons of Jacob and the first son of his beloved Rachel. The woman whom Jacob had waited 14 years to marry, this alone placed Joseph in a special position within the family. Rachel was Jacob's great love, and Joseph was the fruit of that love. The biblical text does not spare words to describe the predilection the father had for this particular son, and this predilection was materialized in a concrete way in a gift that would become a symbol of hatred and envy. The famous tunic of many colors. Imagine the scene. A large family living in a pastoral society, where work was hard and the hierarchies between the brothers had enormous weight. The older brothers worked arduously in the fields, while Joseph, the favorite, received special gifts from his father. It would be naive to think that this differentiated treatment would not create tension. And in fact, it did. But what turned this family tension into something truly explosive were Joseph's dreams. Joseph dreamed. And not only that, he told his dreams to his brothers with a candor that, depending on the angle you look at it, may seem like naivety or may seem like audacity. In one of the dreams, the brothers' sheaves of wheat bowed before Joseph's sheaf. In another, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars prostrated themselves to him. The symbolism was too clear for anyone to fail to understand. The brothers would bow before Joseph, and this message coming from the mouth of the father's own favorite youngest son was the last straw. The scene that followed is one of the most dramatic in the entire book of Genesis. The brothers, far from their father, see Joseph approaching and make a terrible decision. First, they consider killing him. Then, at the insistence of Reuben and Judah, they decide to sell him to a caravan of Ishmaelites passing by toward Egypt. Joseph was 17 years old. He was young, probably still without a beard, full of dreams and confidence in the future. And suddenly, in a single day, everything changed. The tunic was torn, dipped in the blood of a goat, and taken to the father as proof of a death that had not happened. Jacob wept a mourning that lasted years, and Joseph, chained in a caravan of foreign merchants, crossed the desert toward a country he barely knew. No one knows exactly what went through Joseph's mind during that journey. The Bible does not tell us his thoughts, but there is a disturbing verse in the book of Genesis, mentioned almost in passing, that says that when the brothers were sitting to eat after selling him, they heard Joseph begging and did not care. That cry in the well. Those ignored pleas accompanied Joseph far beyond the bottom of that hole. They went with him to Egypt, entered with him into the house of Potiphar, descended with him to prison. But something else also accompanied him. The presence of God. The Egypt to which Joseph arrived was not just any place. It was the most powerful country in the ancient world. On the banks of the Nile, a civilization that had already existed for centuries, had built monuments that to this day challenge human understanding, a sophisticated bureaucracy, an influential priestly class, a system of storage and distribution of resources that was a model for neighboring peoples. And at the center of it all, the Pharaoh, who was not seen only as a king, but as a living deity, the intermediary between the gods and men. It was in this environment that Joseph, a young Hebrew without resources, without family, without status, arrived as merchandise and was bought by Potiphar, a high-ranking official of the Pharaoh, described in the Hebrew text with a title that can be translated as captain of the guard or chief of the executioners, someone who was very close to the central power of Egypt. What happens next is one of the most recurrent movements in Joseph's narrative, the blessing of God that manifests itself visibly, even in the most adverse circumstances. The text says simply that the Lord was with Joseph and that because of this, he prospered, and Potiphar noticed. It did not take long to notice that everything that passed through Joseph's hands went well, that the harvests were better, that the administration was more efficient, that the accounts balanced. And so he did what any intelligent administrator would do. He delegated. He placed Joseph as responsible for his entire house, for all his possessions, for all his operations. Joseph had a natural talent for organization and leadership, but the biblical text is very clear that what was behind this talent was something of another order. It was the hand of God, guiding every step, every decision, every result. And this perception is fundamental to understand everything that comes after, including the meeting with Asenath. But before getting there, Joseph needed to go through one more descent. The wife of Potiphar, whose name the Bible does not record, began to cast glances at the young Hebrew. The text says that Joseph was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance, a description that in the Hebrew language is repeated on purpose to emphasize that he stood out as much in outer beauty as in the general impression he caused. Potiphar's wife insisted repeatedly, and repeatedly Joseph refused, not because the temptation was weak, but because his faithfulness was stronger. He said something that reveals a lot about the state of his soul at that moment. How could I commit such wickedness and sin against God? The temptation was rejected, but the injustice was not avoided. Accused falsely, Joseph was imprisoned. And here is one more descent in a trajectory that seemed to go from bad to worse. But the text returns to repeat the same affirmation. The Lord was with Joseph, and even in prison, the same dynamic was repeated. The jailer realized that there was something different about that man. And once again, Joseph went from prisoner to administrator. It was in prison that Joseph met two officials of the Pharaoh who had fallen into disgrace. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker both had disturbing dreams on the same night. And in the morning, Joseph found them with downcast expressions. When they explained that they were distressed because there was no interpreter for their dreams, Joseph responded with something that defines all his theology. Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And then he interpreted, for the cupbearer, good news. In 3 days, he would be restored to his post. For the baker, there was no way to soften it. In 3 days, he would be executed. And it was exactly what happened. Joseph asked for only one thing from the cupbearer in return: that he remember him when he returned to the palace and speak to the Pharaoh about his situation. But the cupbearer forgot. For 2 whole years, Joseph remained in prison. Forgotten. 2 years is a long time for those who wait. For those who count the days, look at the walls of the prison every morning and wonder if God still remembers you. For those who had dreams of greatness since childhood and is now reduced to managing the chores of a dungeon, but God had not forgotten. He was just waiting for the right moment. The moment arrived when the Pharaoh slept and had 2 dreams that no one could explain. In the first, 7 fat and beautiful cows came out of the Nile and grazed in a verdant meadow. After, 7 lean and ugly cows emerged from the waters and devoured the 7 fat cows without their appearance changing in anything. The second dream followed the same pattern. 7 full and robust ears of corn appeared on a single stalk, and then 7 withered ears burned by the east wind swallowed them. The Pharaoh woke up disturbed, and when none of the wise men of Egypt, with all their knowledge of astronomy, liturgy, and divination, could offer a satisfactory explanation, it was then that the chief cupbearer remembered Joseph. The scene that followed is one of the most dramatic in the entire Bible. Joseph was taken from prison in a hurry, shaved with new clothes, and led to the presence of the Pharaoh. And there, before the most powerful man of the ancient world, Joseph spoke with a clarity and a security that did not come from himself. He interpreted both dreams as being one. 7 years of extraordinary abundance would come upon Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine so severe that the previous abundance would be completely forgotten. But Joseph did not stop at the interpretation. He went further and offered a complete action plan, that the Pharaoh designate a wise and intelligent man to supervise the storage of 1/5 of all production during the 7 years of plenty, that barns be built strategically, that the food be guarded and preserved with care. In this way, when the famine arrived, Egypt would not be destroyed. The Pharaoh looked at Joseph and asked the question that no one expected: could we find another man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? And then the unlikely happened. The Pharaoh took his ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger, ordered him to be dressed in fine linen clothes, put a gold necklace around his neck, and made Joseph go up in his second chariot. The heralds went ahead proclaiming that all of Egypt should bow before that man. Joseph was 30 years old. It had been 13 years since he was away from home, and the young man whom the brothers had sold was now the governor of all of Egypt. It was exactly at that moment, at the peak of his rise, that Asenath entered his story. The Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. The exact meaning of this name is debated by scholars, but there are those who interpret it as the one who reveals the mysteries, or the one who keeps alive. It was a name that carried authority, that marked the transfer of identity necessary for Joseph to function within the structure of the Egyptian state. And together with the new name, the Pharaoh gave Joseph a wife. Her name was Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, the city that the Greeks would later call Heliopolis, the city of the sun. This information, condensed in a few words for in the Hebrew text, carries an immense cultural and religious weight. To understand it fully, we need to understand the world from which Asenath came. Heliopolis was one of the most ancient and most sacred cities in all of Egypt. It was the center of solar worship, dedicated mainly to the god Ra, the sun god, whom the Egyptians considered the supreme deity, the creator and maintainer of all cosmic order. The temple of Ra in Heliopolis was one of the largest and most influential in the entire country, and the priests who served it were not marginal figures. They were men of real power, of political and social influence, with access to the highest spheres of Egyptian administration. Potipharah, the father of Asenath, was one of these men. As a priest of Ra, he had a central role, not only in religious rituals, but also in the intellectual and cultural life of his city. The Egyptian priests were responsible for preserving and transmitting knowledge, for educating future generations in the mysteries of religion and the philosophy of the cosmos. A daughter raised in this environment would have received an education that very few women of the ancient world could dream of. She would have learned about astronomy, about the cycles of the Nile, about the mythology of the gods, about the rituals and the sacred texts. And her own name, Asenath, was part of this religious heritage. Scholars of Hebrew and ancient Egyptian have debated its origin for centuries, but one of the most accepted interpretations is that the name derives from the Egyptian Nesnith, or something similar, meaning belonging to the goddess Nith or consecrated to Nith. Nith was one of the most ancient goddesses of the Egyptian pantheon, associated with war, hunting, weaving, and wisdom. She was represented with a bow and arrows and was considered a powerful protector. That a priest's daughter would receive a name linked to a deity was not uncommon. It was almost a consecration, a sign that that child was in some way dedicated to the spiritual universe. From birth, Asenath grew, therefore, immersed in a world where the gods were present in every aspect of daily life. The sun that rose was Ra. The flooding of the Nile was a manifestation of divine power. The stars were entities with names and stories. Isis, Osiris, Horus, Anubis, Thoth, Neith, Sekhmet. These were not characters from distant legends. They were the inhabitants of the real universe, in which Asenath lived and breathed. Her identity was woven into this worldview with threads that do not easily come undone. And then, suddenly she was given in marriage to a Hebrew. The biblical text does not tell us what Asenath thought or felt when the Pharaoh announced this marriage. We do not know if she met Joseph before the ceremony, if she had any say in the matter, if she felt fear, curiosity, resistance, or openness. The silence of the text at this point is, in a way, eloquent. It reflects the reality of a woman of the ancient world, whose destiny was determined not by her personal preferences, but by the political needs of the state and the decisions of the men around her. From the Pharaoh's point of view, this union made perfect strategic sense. Joseph was a foreigner in a country that valued lineage and connection to local traditions immensely. By giving him a wife from the priestly class, the Pharaoh was, in a way, rooting Joseph in the religious and social fabric of Egypt. The daughter of a priest from one of the most important cities in the country was not a random choice. It was a declaration that Joseph, the Hebrew, now belonged to the Egyptian elite, that he was no longer an outsider, but someone integrated into the power structures of the country he governed. For Joseph, this marriage meant many things at the same time. It was the most concrete sign that his rise was real and not an illusion. It was a new responsibility, that of building a family in a foreign country, far from his father and brothers. And it was also, without a doubt, an encounter with a cultural reality profoundly different from his own. Joseph had been raised in the faith of the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, a God who did not admit competitors, who had revealed himself to his ancestors through promises and covenants, who had conducted his entire life until that moment. And now he was marrying the daughter of a priest, of a God radically different, raised in the heart of a religious system that Joseph had been taught to reject. How did he navigate through this tension? The Bible does not answer directly, but we can read between the lines. The way Joseph named his sons, the first sons who were born from his union with Asenath, reveals much about what was happening inside him during that period. The first son was born during the years of plenty, before the famine arrived. And Joseph called him Manasseh. The name in Hebrew comes from a root that means to forget. And Joseph explained personally the meaning, because God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." There is a melancholic beauty in this declaration. Joseph was not saying he had forgotten literally. He was saying that the pain had passed to the background, that the scar was still there, but it did not torment him anymore in the same way. That God had done something inside him that transformed the suffering into treated memory, not an open wound. Manasseh was the son of relief. It was the proof that God had healed something very deep in Joseph's soul. And nothing communicates this more concretely than the fact that this son was born of Asenath, the Egyptian woman. The daughter of the priest of Ra was the vehicle of this healing. Her presence in Joseph's life, the family they built together, the home they created in a foreign country, all this was part of the process by which God was restoring what had been destroyed by the betrayal of the brothers. The second son was called Ephraim, and the meaning of this name points in a completely different direction. Because God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Observe that Joseph still calls Egypt the land of his affliction after all these years, after all the success, after all the wealth and power. He still saw that land as the place of exile, of suffering. And at the same time, it was precisely there that he was bearing fruit. Ephraim was the son of the redeemed contradiction, the blessing that flourished precisely in the most unlikely place. These two names, Manasseh and Ephraim, tell a complete story. One son for the forgetting of pain, another son for the celebration of the blessing in the middle of the trial. And both were born of Asenath, the Egyptian, the daughter of the priest of the sun, the woman whom the text mentions in a few words, but whose presence was ingrained in the greatest inner transformation of Joseph's life. The years of abundance passed. As the text said, they would pass quickly, and the famine arrived with an amplitude that surprised even those who were prepared. It was not a local or regional famine. It was a famine that spread throughout the Near East, that reached Canaan, the land where Jacob and his sons still lived, where the old father still wept for the loss of his favorite son, where Joseph's brothers still carried the weight of a crime they never confessed. It was the famine that operated the miracle of the reunion. Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy food, and the sons arrived before the governor. They prostrated themselves with their faces to the ground and did not recognize him. But Joseph recognized them immediately. What happened in the months and years that followed is one of the most powerful narratives of reconciliation in human history. Joseph tested the brothers, wanted to see if they had changed, if they were still the men capable of abandoning a brother in a well out of envy, or if time and repentance had transformed them. He observed them closely, disguised behind his power and his Egyptian name. And when he finally could no longer contain himself, when the emotions overflowed beyond what any disguise could hide, he revealed himself. And the crying that filled that room echoed, according to the text, throughout the Pharaoh's house. "Am I not the one who sold you to Egypt?" said Joseph to the brothers paralyzed with fear. "God sent me. He sent me ahead of you to preserve life. It was not you who sent me here, but God." This is perhaps the most theological declaration of his entire story. After everything, after 17 years away from home, of slavery, of unjust prison, of being forgotten, Joseph looked at the brothers who had betrayed him and said, God was behind all of this. It was not naivety. It was not denial of the pain. It was a theology lived in the flesh, an understanding that only comes after having crossed the bottom of the well and exited on the other side. Jacob descended to Egypt with his entire family, 70 people in all, and before dying, the old patriarch gathered his sons to bless them, as was customary, and did something that caught everyone's attention. when it was Joseph's turn. Jacob asked that Joseph's 2 sons be brought to his presence, Manasseh and Ephraim, and then Jacob adopted them formally, declaring that they would be counted not as grandsons, but as sons. They would have an inheritance equal to Jacob's sons. They would be, in effect, ancestors of 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Jacob extended his hands to bless both boys. Tradition commanded that the right hand, the hand of greater honor, be placed on the older, Manasseh, but Jacob crossed his arms. The right hand rested on Ephraim, the youngest, and Joseph, surprised, tried to correct the father, saying that that was the wrong hand, that the firstborn was on the other side, but Jacob did not back down. I know. Son, I know. Also, Manasseh will be great, but his younger brother will surpass him, and his offspring will become the fullness of the nations. Once again, the plan of God transgressing the human logic of primogeniture. Once again, the lesser being chosen. Once again, the hand of God writing straight by lines that seemed crooked. And the 2 sons of Asenath, the Egyptian, the daughter of the priest of the sun, received the blessing that would make them founders of tribes that shaped the history of Israel for centuries. Here is where the biblical story about Asenath essentially ends. There are no more mentions of her after the sons are named and blessed. The Bible does not tell us her death, does not tell us her faith, does not tell us what she thought about the husband's God, does not tell us how she lived the rest of her days while her family was weaving the great tapestry of the history of Israel. She appears, fulfills a fundamental role, and then disappears behind the silence of the text. But this silence, as we said, speaks, and for centuries it has invited scholars, rabbis, philosophers, and narrators to speculate, interpret, and imagine what was behind that brief record, and some of the traditions that arose are extraordinarily rich. One of the most intriguing comes from a midrash, a rabbinic text of biblical interpretation that proposes a theory that seems out of a novel. Asenath would not be Egyptian by blood, but by upbringing. According to this tradition, she would be the daughter of Dinah, the only daughter of Jacob mentioned by name in the scriptures. You perhaps remember the tragic story of Dinah. She went out to meet the women of the land and was raped by Shechem, the prince of the region. The biblical text records the humiliation and the brutal revenge of Dinah's brothers, but does not tell us what happened to her after. According to this midrashic tradition, Dinah became pregnant by her aggressor. She had a daughter, and that daughter, to protect her from the judging glances within Jacob's clan, was sent to Egypt, where she ended up being adopted by Potiphar and his wife, and grew up with the name of Asenath. If this tradition had any historical substance, the marriage of Joseph and Asenath would not be a union between a Hebrew and an Egyptian, but between 2 descendants of Jacob, 2 bearers of the blood of the covenant, reunited by chance and by providence on the banks of the Nile. And their children, Manasseh and Ephraim, would be pure-blooded Israelite, without any mixture with the Egyptian priestly lineage. There is no way to verify this tradition. It is not in the canonical text, but its persistence throughout the centuries speaks of a very human need, that of resolving the tension between the divine promise and the complicated circumstances through which this promise is fulfilled. If Asenath was Jacob's granddaughter, then the apparent contradiction between the monotheistic faith of Joseph and his marriage to the daughter of a pagan priest dissolves. But if she was in fact Egyptian, raised in the worship of Ra and Neith, then what her story tells us is even more powerful. That God is able to fulfill his purposes, even through unions and circumstances that no Orthodox theologian would have approved. There also exists an apocryphal text titled Joseph and Asenath, written in Greek, probably between the 2nd century before Christ and the 1st century of the Christian era, in a time when the Jewish and Hellenistic cultures met and mixed in the great Mediterranean cities. especially in Alexandria, in Egypt. This text is not part of the Bible, neither of the Jewish canon, nor of the Christian, but was widely read and commented in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, especially in Eastern Christian communities. The text fills the silences of the biblical account with an elaborate, dramatic, and, in many aspects, beautiful narrative. Asenath is described as a young woman of exceptional beauty, proud of her lineage, deeply devoted to the Egyptian gods, and completely closed to any man who came from outside. When she hears for the first time about Joseph, the priest's daughter reacts with disdain. Why would she need a Hebrew, no matter how powerful he was? But when Joseph arrives and she sees him, something breaks inside. The apocryphal narrative uses the language of love at first sight, but what is being described is more than physical attraction. It is a recognition. Asenath looks at Joseph and perceives that there is something in that man that does not exist in any of the men she has known. A light in the eyes, a peace in the posture, an integrity that emanates from every gesture. And she wants to know where that comes from. Joseph, in the apocryphal text, initially rejects her, not because he is indifferent, but because she still worships other gods. A woman who bows to idols cannot be embraced by a servant of the living God. But then Joseph prays for her, and something begins to move. The text then enters into a long and poetic sequence in which Asenath goes through a process of conversion. She abandons the idols, literally throws them out the window. She fasts, humbles herself, cries before the God of Joseph, whom she does not yet know by name, but whose reality begins to feel in her soul. And then an angelic figure appears to her and announces that her transformation was accepted, that she has a new name in the registers of heaven, that she belongs now to God. The theological message of the apocryphal text is clear and quite bold for its time. No one is on the outside of God's reach because of their origin, neither the daughter of a pagan priest, nor a child raised in the worship of gods that do not exist. What matters is not where you come from, but where you turn to. Looking at the story of Asenath through the lens of what would come after, what calls most attention is the dimension of her descendants. The children she gave birth to in an Egyptian palace. Children of an exiled Hebrew and of a priestess of the sun, became the ancestors of two of the most important tribes in the history of Israel. The tribe of Manasseh, that of the firstborn, occupied extensive territories in the Promised Land, both to the east and to the west of the Jordan River. It was a tribe marked by extension, by the diversity of geographical realities, and by the role of guarding borders. Among its descendants are counted figures like Gideon, the judge who with 300 men defeated an immense army, whose story is one of the most memorable accounts of the book of Judges. The tribe of Ephraim, that of the youngest son, who received the greater blessing, became with time the most influential of the entire northern kingdom of Israel. When, after the death of King Solomon, the unified monarchy split into two kingdoms, it was Ephraim who assumed the leadership of the north. The prophet Hosea, who acted centuries later in the northern kingdom, frequently uses the name Ephraim as a synonym for Israel entirely. It was a tribe that had grown so much in number and in influence that it had become, in practice, the name of an entire nation. Joshua, the great successor of Moses, the man who led Israel into the Promised Land, was from the tribe of Ephraim. Samuel, the prophet who anointed the first two kings of Israel, is also associated with this territory. The list of Ephraimite figures who shaped the biblical history is long and impressive, and behind all this legacy, almost invisible in the text, but present in every thread of the narrative, is Asenath, woman from whose descendants came leaders, prophets, warriors, and kings. The woman whom the Bible mentions briefly. but without whom the history of Israel would have been radically different. What the story of Asenath teaches in the end, it transcends the historical details and the speculations about her origin or her faith. What it teaches us is something about the nature of God's plan and about the way this plan is fulfilled in the real world, in the messy and complicated world of human beings. With their wounded stories, their diverse origins, and their unexpected journeys, Joseph did not choose to go to Egypt, did not choose to be sold by his brothers, did not choose to be enslaved, did not choose to be imprisoned unjustly, did not choose to be forgotten for 2 years at the bottom of a dungeon, and certainly did not choose, in an ideal life, to marry the daughter of a priest of a God who was not his God. But in each of these circumstances that he did not choose, there was an invisible hand working. And the final result of all this tapestry of pain and providence was that the people of Israel were saved from a devastating famine, that an impossible reconciliation happened, that a destroyed family was reunited, and that 2 sons were born of an unlikely union to found 2 tribes that would mark forever the identity of the nation of God. The faith that Joseph maintained throughout this entire journey was not a faith that denied the reality of suffering. It was a faith that insisted that suffering did not have the last word, that there was something bigger in motion, something that he could not see completely, but that he had learned to trust. And this confidence was the link that kept Joseph connected to his identity and to his purpose. Even when everything around him suggested that abandonment was total, Asenath, in her turn, whatever may have been her personal spiritual journey, whether she is the native Egyptian that the Bible describes, whether she is the secret granddaughter of Jacob from the Midrashic tradition, whether she is the transformed woman of the apocryphal text, she represents something very important. The possibility that people from completely different worlds can be woven together into a purpose that surpasses them both. She was from another world, from another faith, from another people, and yet was chosen to be part of a story that was much larger than she could imagine when she was still a child in the temple of Heliopolis. Listening to the chants to the sun god, the silence that surrounds Asenath in the biblical text can frustrate those who want definitive answers. What did she think? What did she believe? How did she live the rest of her life? Died before or after Joseph? Saw the children grow and assume their roles in the history of Israel? The Bible does not answer, and perhaps this lack of answer is in itself a message. Because the story is not about her individually. It is about something that transcends any individual character. The red thread of God's faithfulness through the generations that does not break even when the circumstances suggest that everything is broken. What we know is enough. We know that she existed, that her marriage to Joseph was real, that their children were real, that Jacob's blessing upon them was real, and that the tribes that were born from that family divided between 2 worlds, between Canaan and Egypt, between the faith of Abraham and the temples of Ra. These tribes were real and left marks that we can still trace in the pages of the scriptures and in the history of the people of God. There is a type of faith that only develops in the most unlikely circumstances, that only matures in exile, in prison, in the house of the foreign lord, in the dark cell where no one remembers you. Joseph developed this type of faith throughout 13 years of humiliation and waiting. And when he finally reached the top, when the Pharaoh's ring was on his finger and the gold necklace on his neck, he did not lose this faith. On the contrary, he found in it the foundation upon which he built everything else, including a family, including a home, including 2 sons who carried in their own name the testimony of what God had done. Manasseh. Because God has made me forget the suffering. Ephraim. Because God has made me fruitful in the land of affliction. These 2 names are together a credo, a summary of all the lived theology of Joseph, a testimony that it is possible to reach the other side of the deepest pain and find there not only survival, but flourishing, not only scars, but fruit, not only memory of a destroyed past, but the concrete reality of a restored present. And Asenath was there in the shadows of the text, in the silence of the pages, but present in the name of the two sons, present in the continuity of the lineage, present in the tapestry that God was weaving with threads of all kinds, including the most unlikely, including those that come from the temple of the sun god in the heart of Egypt. This is the mystery and the beauty of the sacred history, that it rarely happens the way we expect or the way we plan, that the instruments that God chooses to fulfill his purposes frequently surprise us, disconcert us, and then, when we look back with the benefit of distance, make us incline our head in silent admiration. Joseph was one of those instruments. Asenath was one of those instruments. Manasseh and Ephraim were those instruments. And the story that began with a torn tunic at the bottom of a well in Dothan, in the land of Canaan, ended centuries later with two powerful tribes, with a people surviving a devastating famine, and with a promise that had been made to Abraham in a desert long before any of these characters had been born, fulfilling itself in ways that no one had anticipated. This is the greatness of divine providence. It does not ask where you come from. It does not require that the path be straight. It works with what exists, with who exists, where it exists, and weaves with all this something that can only be called a miracle when seen from far enough to perceive the pattern behind the apparent chaos. The story of Joseph and Asenath is one of these stories, and it deserves to be told. They're reread and contemplated not only as a record of the past, but as an invitation for each person who hears it to ask themselves, in what part of my own story is God working in ways that I still cannot see? What apparently impossible circumstances are being used to fulfill something that goes far beyond my present understanding? These questions do not have easy answers, but Joseph and Asenath, each in their own way, lived the proof that they have true answers, and that perhaps is enough to continue. But before closing, it is worth pausing for a moment on an aspect of Joseph's story, which is often addressed in a superficial way: the dimension of forgiveness. Because Joseph's reunion with his brothers in Egypt was not only a dramatic and emotional encounter, it was one of the most extraordinary acts of forgiveness in the Bible. And its depth can only be completely appreciated when we remember everything that Joseph had gone through before reaching that moment. Think of this for an instant. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt for the second time, bringing with them Benjamin, the youngest, and before the governor, who they still did not know to be the brother they had sold, Joseph had to withdraw to another room because he could not contain his tears. The text says that he went to his room and wept there and then washed himself and returned. This minor detail tells a huge story. Joseph was not a machine, had not anesthetized his feelings with time or with power. When he saw the brothers' faces, when he looked at Benjamin, Rachel's son, who had stayed with his father, the emotions that exploded inside him were intense, to the point of needing an isolated room to not disintegrate in public. And what is remarkable is that these emotions were not anger. They were love. They were longing. They were pain transformed into tenderness. How does one reach this point? How can someone who was torn from the family at 17 years old by a betrayal of his own brothers, who spent years as a slave, who was imprisoned by a lie, who was forgotten even after helping those who could have freed him, how can someone like this look at the faces of those responsible for all that pain and cry with love? The answer is in the theology that Joseph developed throughout his entire journey. That phrase he said to the brothers, "It was not you. It was God." It was not just a beautiful speech. It was the conclusion of a process of interpreting life that took years to mature. Joseph had arrived at the deep conviction that his story, even in its darkest chapters, had been conducted by a larger hand. And if it was God who conducted, then the brothers were, in a way, instruments of a plan that surpassed them. What they had done with the intention of destroying had been used to build something that none of them could have imagined. This does not mean that their wickedness was indifferent. It means that the sovereignty of God is large enough to work even with the evil intentions of men and transform them into part of a redemptive purpose. It is a courageous and uncomfortable theology because it takes away the possibility of using the injustices we suffer as a permanent justification for bitterness. Joseph did not become bitter, and it is difficult not to wonder what was Asenath's role. What was the role of having a house, a family, children who called for him? When a man reaches the end of a long day of administering the resources of a nation and finds at home a woman, 2 children, a space of belonging, something is being repaired inside him that no professional success can repair alone. Asenath did not save Joseph from his pain, but perhaps she was the human face through which God was day by day rebuilding what had been shattered. There is also something to be said about the broader historical moment in which the story of Joseph and Asenath is inserted. The period in which Joseph lived in Egypt was probably a period of great openness and social mobility in that country. Archaeological and historical studies suggest that the period known as the Second Intermediate Period, when Semitic groups, called Hyksos, dominated parts of Egypt, may have created conditions in which a Hebrew like Joseph could have ascended to power more easily than in other periods of Egyptian history. Some scholars place the story of Joseph precisely in this context, in which Semitic foreigners had access to positions of authority that, in more traditional pharaonic times, would have been unthinkable. If this is true, then Asenath's marriage was not just a political concession, but also a reflection of an Egyptian society in transformation, in which the borders between ethnic and cultural groups were being renegotiated. The Egypt that Asenath knew was not static. It was a living country, in motion, facing external and internal pressures, trying to reconfigure itself. And her marriage to a Hebrew who had become the second man of the country was, in this context, less exceptional than it might appear at first glance. This helps us to imagine Asenath not only as a symbolic figure, but as a real woman, living in a real time, in a country that was changing around her, married to a man who was at the same time foreign and powerful, father of her children, and defender of a faith that she perhaps had progressively learned to know. There is a parallel that Christian scholars, throughout the centuries, have frequently drawn between the story of Asenath and other stories of foreign women who enter the lineage of the people of God in the Bible. Ruth is the most obvious example, Moabite by birth. Ruth married an Israelite, became a widow, and then took the unexpected decision to follow her mother-in-law Naomi back to the land of Judah, declaring that Naomi's people would be her people and Naomi's God would be her God. This declaration of loyalty and faith from a foreign woman generated a genealogy that ends in King David, and according to the New Testament, in Jesus of Nazareth. Rahab is another example. A Canaanite prostitute in Jericho who hid the Israelite spies and made with them a pact that protected her when the city was destroyed. She also appears in the genealogy of Jesus. These examples reveal a recurrent pattern in the biblical narrative. God does not build his people from an airtight ethnic or cultural purity. He builds his people from encounters, from crossings, from unexpected inclusions of foreigners who turn to the God of Israel and are incorporated into the sacred history. Men and women of diverse origins who, through crooked paths, end up being part of the central thread of the narrative of redemption. Asenath fits into this pattern, even if the biblical text does not make explicit her personal faith. She was incorporated into the lineage of Israel, not by choice of Jacob's sons, who in fact, if it depended on them, would probably never have approved the brothers' marriage to an Egyptian of priestly origin. She was incorporated by decree of the Pharaoh, by political necessity, by divine providence, which operated through circumstances that the orthodox religious logic of the time would have rejected. When Jacob was about to die in Egypt, after having seen Joseph and having blessed Manasseh and Ephraim, he asked something of Joseph. He asked that he not be buried in Egypt, that they take his bones back to Canaan, to be deposited in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah and Leah were buried. It was the final affirmation of a belonging. Jacob's body belonged to that land which had been promised. Egypt, no matter how generous it had been, was the land of exile. Canaan was the land of the promise. And Joseph fulfilled this request with great pomp and solemnity. In a procession that the Egyptians made a point of honoring with the presence of high dignitaries, Jacob's bones were transported back to Canaan. And when the moment of Joseph's own death arrived, he made the same request. When God visits you and makes you go up from this land, take my bones from here. There was something in Joseph that had never ceased to belong to Canaan. Even after 40 years in Egypt, even after having been governor, even after having married Asenath and raised children there, there was a deeper identity, a memory of origin, a faithfulness to the promise that did not fade with time or with prosperity. And this faithfulness was passed on to the children, to the tribes that came later, to the people that centuries later would leave Egypt to the sound of trumpets and cross the sea, carrying with them literally the bones of the ancestor who had kept the faith even in the land of exile. Joseph's bones were finally buried in Shechem, in the land of Canaan, as he had requested. The text of Joshua records this in a simple but touching way. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they buried in Shechem. It was the fulfillment of a promise made centuries before, on the deathbed of an elder who had seen enough of God's providence to trust in it even beyond death. It is impossible to end the story of Joseph and Asenath without thinking of the questions it leaves open for us. Because the biblical stories are never just about the characters that star in them. They are mirrors in which each generation that reads them finds something of its own situation reflected. How many of us carry stories of betrayal that seemed like the end of everything? How many of us have been placed in situations that we did not choose, in metaphorically foreign lands, far from everything we loved and knew, without seeing a way out? How many of us have been at the bottom of the well, in the dark dungeon, waiting for a liberation that seemed never to arrive? And how many of us have experienced the surprise of looking back after a long time and realizing that that period of darkness had been, in some way that we could not see at the time, the period in which the deepest roots were being formed, that the famine that had scared us had been the reason why the barn was built, that the exile had been the path to the encounter that changed everything. The story of Joseph is not a story about how God saves us from suffering. It is a story about how God works within the suffering, throughout the suffering, through the suffering, to fulfill purposes that go far beyond what any of those involved could imagine. It is a story about patience and faithfulness in a long time, in a time that surpasses our natural horizons of understanding. And Asenath, the mysterious, the silent, the woman whose name and whose children cross centuries, is an inseparable part of this story. She reminds us that God's plan has room for everyone, for those who were born within the tradition and for those who arrived from outside, for those who always knew the name of God and for those who learned that name late, in an unexpected encounter with someone from whom they never expected to learn. The story is still being written, and who knows what role you are being called to play in it. Even if the text has not yet revealed your name fully, there is one last reflection that is worth making before closing, and it concerns what we could call the theology of names in the story of Joseph. throughout his entire trajectory. The names carry weight. Joseph himself received an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. When he was raised to power by the pharaoh, Asenath carried in her name a reference to an Egyptian goddess. Manasseh and Ephraim carried in their name the lived theology of the father. And later, when Jacob blessed Joseph's sons, he declared that the name of Abraham and of Isaac would be invoked upon them. The children of an Egyptian mother would be called by the name of the patriarchs of Israel. This layer of overlapping names is a powerful image of what the Bible is doing throughout the entire history of Joseph, showing that identity is not a simple, linear, or pure thing. Identity is a conversation between origins and choices, between heritage and transformation, between who you were born and who you become in the course of life. Manasseh and Ephraim were born with Egyptian blood in their veins and with Jacob's blessing on their head. They carried the name of a priestess mother and the legacy of a Hebrew father and were called to be tribes of Israel. This is radical and it is beautiful because it means that God's covenant is not a closed club with rules of blood and ethnicity that determine it. It is a living and expansive reality, capable of incorporating the foreigner, the unlikely, the unexpected. The same covenant that began with Abraham in a desert of Ur, crossed centuries, crossed borders, went through slavery and exile, survived betrayals and misunderstandings, and went on revealing along the way a generosity that the participants themselves frequently could not understand. Asenath is part of this covenant, not because someone included her formally, not because she signed a document or went through a recognized ceremony, but because God placed her in the right place, at the right time, beside the right man. And the children that were born of this union were declared bearers of the promise. Sometimes, the inclusion in God's plan happens in ways that do not fit into any human protocol. And perhaps it is exactly in that there is one of the most disturbing and liberating messages of his entire story. Throughout this script, we traversed a long and rich trajectory. We visited the bottom of the well in Dothan. We entered the chambers of Potiphar's house. We descended to prison, where the dreams continued even in the darkness. We witnessed the encounter with the Pharaoh and the unlikely rise. We met Heliopolis and the temples of Ra. We tried to imagine who Asenath was, where she came from, and what her encounter with Joseph might have meant for her. We followed the births of Manasseh and Ephraim and the crossed blessing of Jacob, and we reflected on the silence that surrounds Asenath in the biblical text and what that silence as much hides as reveals. In the end, we always return to the same arrival point: providence. This word, a little old and sometimes underestimated, which describes the conviction that there is an intelligence and a love working behind the scenes of human history, not in a way to eliminate the suffering or to erase the free will, but in a way to guarantee that the suffering does not have the last word, that the free will, even when used for evil, cannot abort the purpose of God, that the longest exile ends with a return, that the deepest well has an exit. Joseph believed in this and lived to see this belief confirmed in ways that surpassed everything he could have imagined when he was that teenager full of dreams in a dysfunctional family in the land of Canaan. If you have arrived here, thank you for walking together in this reflection. Stories like this were not written only to be read. They were written to be inhabited, to be brought into one's own experience, to be a source of strength in the moments in which the well seems to have no bottom. May the story of Joseph and Asenath do that for you, living Bible,